There you go. Yep, we can see it well.
Perfect. Thanks, Diego. Great. Well, many thanks for that introduction, Diego. And yeah, I look forward to our discussion after the presentation. So to first of all set some expectations, this afternoon's talk will be quite different and feel to Professor Berliner's discussion on nostalgia last session, as it will instead be more of a technical report on the findings of an extended research intervention which concluded earlier this year. A research project which, as you shall see, had many successes, but also had some significant limitations. And I look forward to unpacking both of these at the end of the presentation, perhaps. So the Water Sustainable Point of Use Treatment Technologies, or WaterSPOUTT project, which is certainly a title which certainly follows the proud tradition of academic research acronyms, was a large EU H2020 funded transdisciplinary research project drawing on the expertise from 18 partners from academia and industry. It was a natural science dominated project, mainly engineering and microbiological, aimed to study new methods of providing treated drinking water to communities who rely on unsafe sources, whereby a consortium of scholars based in Europe and Africa carried out a technological development program to advance 3 applications based on solar disinfection, or SODIS, which can increase water safety after it has been collected. This has been facilitated by a program drawing on support from local authorities, structured to both assist with and encourage the adoption of these technologies by the target communities in rural and peri-urban Africa in an economically sustainable way. In parallel to this, but slightly detached from it, a social science research stream sought to deeply explore the broader water lives of these communities, both in relation to their interaction with these SODIS technologies, but also more broadly. This paper primarily considers the former, the direct engagement of these communities with these SODIS technologies, placing preeminence to the perspectives and responses of the participants themselves, but also considers this direct engagement within the wider social and economic context of these regions. As such, it seeks to offer a window in the lived experiences of the actual day-to-day application of these 3 SODIS technologies, as explained by those actually making use of them in the field. I can't see, there we go. That's a new slide. The impetus and inspiration for this research project can be seen here, with the WHO estimating that around 159 million people still collect drinking water directly from surface water sources, with around 58% of these living in sub-Saharan Africa. Coupled with this, the untreated and contaminated water also is a major issue in the aftermath of large-scale disasters, especially floods, cyclones, and so on. And it was hoped that these technologies might also have some positive application in disaster relief and response. For our focus on regular users, clearly poverty is a critical variable in access to treated water. Point of use drinking water treatment and related sustainable improvements are impacted by the economic vulnerability and resilience of households and the community within which they are located, as well as the technological and mechanical usability and effectiveness of the technology itself. A priority for the wider social science stream connected to WaterSPOUTT has been understanding the socio-cultural, economic, and institutional dynamics of the community and household context of water resourcing, and identifying dynamics that affect the water lives of people in households as critical to planning effective drinking water treatment. This package particularly explored governance, gender, and access, but also fed back into every aspect of the project as a whole, and significantly expanded the knowledge production capacity of the other work streams by explaining the complexities of local context. The social science work stream also included a significant community engagement and education package, both to work with local participants in shared dialogue workshops in order to incorporate local expertise into the development cycle, and to build awareness of the benefits and proper use of SODIS and associated water treatment and hygiene. To this end, this paper draws upon detailed findings from 3 selected rural communities in the lower income countries of Ethiopia, Malawi, and Uganda, which I shall introduce momentarily. Across all field sites, the bulk of social science data was generated from a quantitative baseline socio-spatial survey of households, an ethnographically informed qualitative follow-up investigation based around focus group discussions with users and non-users, as well as semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders, and several shared dialogue workshops conducted before, during, and after the field trials of these technologies. These SDWs were key in the design and development process and helped the engineering teams in particular greatly enhance the usability of their final technologies, as I shall discuss later. This paper seeks to foreground these perspectives and reflections of local participants in preference to external analysis and provides the listener a window into the complexity and precariousness of the lived experience of those living in these field sites with regard to water, especially as it pertains to water treatment. As such, it shall first offer brief explanations of both WaterSPOUTT project and Seumas technologies it deployed, while also considering the responses of key participants to questioning related to these novel approaches to water treatment, before finally offering some brief concluding thoughts on the effectiveness and longevity of this intervention. Site selection for the 3 rural study sites was based around proximity and primary dependence on nearby unsafe water sources. A site was considered especially favorable to participation if it experienced especially high levels of diarrhea, dysentery, especially amongst children. And this was one of the primary metrics that especially the natural science streams of the project were using to determine the relative effectiveness of the different technologies, was measuring rates of diarrhea amongst younger children, especially under 5. The field sites chosen for this project were villages across the Tigray region of Ethiopia, the Luengo region of Uganda, and the Chikwawa region of Malawi. And apart from all relying on unsafe water sources, there were otherwise few similarities geographically or in terms of culture or water governance, though all did share a comparable distinction based on gender around who was considered primarily responsible for gathering and treating water. And I've included just some images of 4 of our field sites in Ethiopia as an example of what we're talking about when we mention open source water gathering sites. And you can see 4 of them here on the screen. So to talk about these sites, just briefly, in Ethiopia, Tigray is a semi-arid region in the north of Ethiopia with an extremely rural population. The chosen villages rely primarily on waterholes, ponds, or a stream, all of which are also used by cattle and other animals, as you saw in the previous slide. The area has a rainy season peaking in July and August, with an average volume of rainfall of around 615 millimeters per year. Luengo is a savanna region in southern Uganda. The region is primarily rural again, with farming being the dominant occupation. Water is primarily gathered from dug wells and boreholes, and the region experiences 2 rainy seasons, March to May and September to November, with average rainfall of around 950 millimeters per year. However, due to climate change, this rainfall is becoming erratic and droughts are becoming more common. Finally, Chikwawa is a rural tropical region within southern Malawi, dominated by the Shire River, which is, along with its tributaries, a primary source of water for local communities. The river also provides water for a canal network controlled by local sugar plantations, which are also used by participant communities as a key water source. The region has a rainy season between November and April, with an average rainfall of around 1,130 millimeters per year. So you can see from there 3 very, very different field sites, 3 very, very different geographies and meteorological states. I should note that WaterSPOUTT also operated in one peri-urban informal settlement site with tapped water from the middle-income country of South Africa. However, the social context of this location generated responses so significantly different that they became very difficult to draw meaningful comparisons with the other field sites, and thus shall not be considered here. Basically, the people in Nkinini in South Africa didn't end up using the SODIS technologies for water consumption, and therefore their responses to questions were quite different to the other three sites. So how does SODIS actually work? Solar disinfection is a process of water treatment which firstly utilizes solar UV light to damage microbes, and secondly uses heat inhibition of endogenous microbial repair mechanisms to prevent their return. This process is achieved by exposing untreated water to direct sunlight in a transparent container over a prolonged period, usually several hours. But this has traditionally only been attempted in containers of around 1 to 2 liters, and it has been demonstrated to be extremely effective in killing or rendering inactive all sorts of viruses and bacteria. E. coli, cryptosporidia, all sorts of nasty stuff is dealt with effectively by the SODIS technique. The core objective of the WaterSPOUTT project was advancing and improving on these SODIS techniques and technologies to increase access to affordable clean water in 4 field sites in Africa. In particular, the project hoped to build on previous work by significantly increasing the volume of the containers used in solar water treatment, and ideally to produce these containers in a way which was easily accessible to users in these communities long after the conclusion of the WaterSPOUTT project. It should probably go without saying that containers of 1 to 2 liters are not particularly useful for a family of 4 or 5 or 6. You would need a hell of a lot of them to get any use. As such, what WaterSPOUTT was doing was this work resulted in the production and testing of 3 technologies across the 4 field sites. In Ethiopia, a 25-liter clear plastic jerry can. In Malawi, a 20-liter clear plastic bucket, as we refer to them, both of which were intended for household use and were distributed to families with children under 5 years old. While in Uganda and South Africa, a much larger 200-liter reactor were deployed, which were fixed installations and were combined with rainwater harvesting tanks, and based in the Uganda case, based in primary schools, to be used by students and faculty. I'll discuss each of these technologies more in a moment, and as you'll see, the social science-based shared dialogue workshops were integral in their design and development processes alongside the engineering work streams. The results vary between the technologies. Each appears to have been effective in reducing microbial contamination to some extent. So, deeply understanding the uptake and application of these SODIS technologies was a core part of the social science investigation into the water lives of respondents. Understanding how these technologies were understood and positioned within the established and ongoing social context of these communities is critical, and failure to properly account for the reception and possible resistance to these interventions could damage their long-term viability. As such, this section shall discuss the responses participants offered to direct questioning regarding SODIS, as well as considering instances in which SODIS was discussed as a result of questioning on other topics, such as conflict or political agency. However, context is always key. And as noted above, the qualitative engagement with participants was informed and structured by an earlier quantitative socio-spatial survey. Here it was established that across the 3 field sites prior to the introduction of SODIS, only 60% of respondents treated water before consumption regularly. Though this average obfuscates significant national differences, with 90% of Ugandans reporting that they consistently treated their water, with only 55% of Malawian and 40% of Ethiopian respondents stating that they regularly did so. When asked about pre-existing awareness of SODIS, Uganda was again distinct, with 70% of respondents stating that they were aware of the technique, with only 10% of Ethiopians and 5% of Malawians having heard of it. Of those who reported they had heard of SODIS prior to WaterSPOUTT, around half had direct experience of using the technique, with the majority of these direct users obviously being based in Uganda. However, even amongst households who had used SODIS technologies in the past, there was no indication that they had been adopted as a regular method of water treatment, reflecting that cultural, socioeconomic, institutional, and environmental factors play an enormous part in determining uptake of treatment methods. Overall, in both quantitative and qualitative investigations, Ethiopian and Malawian respondents were very likely to cite potential health benefits as a reason to adopt SODIS technologies, and its simplicity and cost effectiveness being other important points in its favor. Conversely, discussions of the Ugandan water reactors were framed within broader discussions related to infrastructure and power hierarchies, because their placement in operation meant that they were locally discussed and interacted with as if they were an infrastructure project, such as a borehole, rather than as a domestic water treatment system, such as the buckets and jerry cans, or indeed chlorination or boiling. Respondents were very positive about the overall impact of the reactor, and some did report a positive effect on children's health. However, they were much more likely to focus on the reduction in labor hours and the finances required to be expended to treat water for consumption, as you see on the table on screen. It seems likely that this contrast to Ugandan respondents comes from the comparatively much higher rates of generalized water treatment reported there. And it is important and is an important structuring factor when understanding the research's qualitative data. Indeed, the results of qualitative focus groups and semi-structured interviews add significant depth to this quantitative data and reveal some of its contradictions, exceptions, nuances, and caveats to that reporting. After first briefly contextualizing each site with data from the wider investigation of water lives, let's look at some of these responses along with the specific SODIS technology deployed to each site. Firstly, Ethiopia. Ethiopian respondents were consistent with Malawi and Uganda in reporting they would consume between 2 and 5 jerry cans of water per family per day. This was found across all 3 sites. This water would be gathered usually by women or children from open source water sites on average 2 kilometers away from their homes, though in some communities this water would be brought by donkey and then shared or purchased in the village. For those who made these lengthy journeys, however, many reported concern for their personal safety, often from wild animals or industrial traffic on the nearby road. Politically, respondents in Ethiopia considered the local government to be responsible for providing communities with water, and several participant villages discussed piped water projects which were began, then abandoned, or completed but unmaintained. However, respondents also discussed the role and impact of the Women's Development Army as a strong balance in the male-dominated political hierarchies, and as a way of having their frustrations in the lack of water infrastructure heard. Given their ubiquitousness, WaterSPOUTT initially sought to reproduce in shape and size the type of jerry can commonly used in these communities, as you see on your screen right now. However, to make this classic jerry can model transparent so that 20 liters of water could be treated in one go, in a vessel which could easily be transported to and from water gathering sites. However, these 2 fellas came along and their kin. And as a result of various shared dialogue workshops, it quickly became apparent that unless the produced jerry can could survive what we ended up dubbing the donkey kick test, it simply wouldn't be viable as a product that would be used in these communities. Advancements within the project produced clear plastic jerry cans which were either too brittle or ended up being too opaque and too full of imperfections to make SODIS effective. And ultimately, the sort of jerry can model, as you see on the backs of these donkeys, had to be abandoned. Instead, A more modest jerry can equivalent bottle was distributed, as you can see on the screen now. These larger, again, 20-litre clear plastic bottles, which had intended to have a handle attached around the neck, which were, it turned out, very effective at SODIS, during the SODIS process, at reducing instances of microbes. Similar to Malawi, discussed in a moment, and in contrast to Uganda, discussed later, responses to the focus questioning regarding these jerry cans in Ethiopia suggested that participants were conceptualizing this SODIS technology as they would any other domestic water treatment option, comparable to chlorination or boiling. The vast majority of participants were very positive about the effectiveness and usability of the jerry cans in their descriptions of their use. Often, they were contrasted to other methods of purification, especially boiling, and considered to be much less labor-intensive and more efficient. Participants and users were generally positive about the effectiveness of the jerry cans, and some reported that they had switched from their previously used water treatment method. Others mentioned that they used it as to supplement to their disinfection by using it when the Wur Egar, a chlorine-based water treatment, ran out. Overall, participants reported either a steady or a somewhat improved rate of illness amongst their children, and several non-users were keen to receive SODIS bottles of their own. However, the bottles were also not without criticism. The design was considered somewhat flimsy for continual long-term use, and concerns were raised about the long-term durability of the bottles. Specific parts of the design were also critiqued, with the very fragile nature of the bottle's handle. As you can see here on the images, it has already broken off from these two, and a lack of a tap for easy access, both being specifically mentioned. Indeed, the problem of decanting water from vessel to vessel emerged as the principal issue reported in the bottle's design. Participants also noted the divisions created in the participant villages, whereby some families received SODIS bottles and thus could reliably treat water cheaply, while others did not receive them and were obliged to continue drinking unsafe water or spend money to purchase treatment techniques, other treatment techniques. This was a consistent issue, particularly reported in Ethiopia, and without the ability to purchase similar bottles at the market, there occasionally formed something of a them and us division, which was obviously highly problematic. Finally, it is clear there are still a small minority of respondents who have doubts about the effectiveness of the jerry cans as a treatment technique, and doubtless compounded by government mandated warnings which are affixed to all commercially sold bottled waters, which instruct those purchasing the bottle not to leave the bottle in direct sunlight. The exact thing our team was instructing users to do. And this was a constant challenge in the Ethiopian context, was pushing back against these government health warnings. In Malawi, most participants reported a shorter distance traversed to gather water than was seen in Ethiopia, generally between 500 and 1,000 meters. For many respondents, this was accessing nearby irrigation canals used by local sugar plantations. These canals, however, were incredibly dangerous, being infested with crocodiles, and were seasonally drained to water sugar crops. In contrast to Ethiopia, Malawian respondents discussing primary responsibility for water provision listed a huge number of local and regional government offices, regional committees, members of traditional leadership, health workers, NGOs, and local corporations. Curiously, in this specific region where this research was conducted, a local large sugar plantation has often provided the funds for water infrastructure improvements, but has generally prioritized villages where many of their residents are employees at the plantation, and overlooked communities with fewer members who work on their farms. Jerry cans are less common in this part of Malawi, and as such, WaterSPOUTT based their design on the much more common plastic bucket. Here on your screen, you see the SODIS bucket from Malawi concept, which was arguably a slightly over-engineered design, which featured an extensive solid plastic filtration system built in within the bucket, which ultimately ended up being far too expensive to mass produce in Malawi itself. As such, to try and keep filtration as part of the design, initially terracotta filters inserted into buckets were suggested as a possible replacement. However, unfortunately, none survived the trip from Europe to Malawi to be installed in the various test sites, all of them shattering in transit. Thankfully, the local shared dialogue workshops once again provided a locally relevant solution to this, and traditionally used cloth filters, as you see in the bottom right there, were produced by a local fabric company very, very cheaply, or at least very, very cost effectively, and were used instead of any kind of plastic or terracotta filter. Also very much in keeping with established local knowledge. And you see here the final products, especially down in the bottom right there. Participants were handed the clear plastic buckets, which were used for the actual Seumas treatments, a cloth filter, which could be used to strain particulates from the water to enhance that process where needed, which could then be decanted into the blue plastic buckets below, which, as you can see, feature a small tap for easy access to the water. As with Ethiopia, the focus groups and semi-structured interviews conducted in Malawi provided rich data related to experiences of using the Seumas technology deployed there, the bucket. Similar to Ethiopia, respondents in Malawi discussed the bucket as a domestic treatment technique, and they were broadly very positive about their experience using it and commented that they would certainly recommend the technology to others. A key part of this recommendation comes from the significant reduction in cases of diarrhea reported by both participants and health workers. And in every location, respondents asserted that buckets have a positive impact on their health. There was also no difficulty reported actually using the buckets, though unlike in Ethiopia, there was no decrease in workload reported from moving to Seumas water treatment systems. What's more, initial problems with livestock and children damaging the buckets appear to have been effectively addressed by the construction of racks to store the buckets while they were being exposed to the sun. It was also welcomed from the point of view of those that they were provided for free, and it was mentioned that for those having difficulty affording WaterGuard, a chemical water treatment, it offered a potential economic saving. Despite this broad endorsement, there were some significant areas pointed to requiring improvement too. Most significantly, the integrity of the bucket itself. It was reported across several of the focus groups and interviews that the bucket loses structural integrity, becoming soft after long-term exposure to sunshine. Beyond this issue, some respondents stated that the taps in the buckets had begun to leak, but that after repair work was carried out, this issue was resolved. Strengthening the tap and the plastic of the bucket, along with potentially increasing its size, were the main requests found during the focus group discussions. There was also an understanding that the buckets could not be used during the rainy season due to cloud cover. And so there was disappointment that this was not a total system and that boiling of water would have to be reinstated at that time. Interestingly, in general questioning around water treatment techniques, Seumas was discussed even amongst respondents who did not receive the Seumas technology. And it is clear that word of mouth has been somewhat successful in explaining the treatment process between communities. This is potentially due to the much greater efforts in Malawi to source local manufacturers for both the clear Seumas buckets and the cloth filters, and there remains a possibility that both the bucket and the filters will become available for purchase in the region without further WaterSPOUTT intervention. Finally, the Ugandan context is naturally somewhat different to Malawi and Ethiopia, given the Seumas reactors were installed in schools rather than in homes. However, participants in Uganda were more likely to report accessing water from boreholes rather than naturally occurring rivers or pools, as in the other sites. The planned construction of these sites therefore meant that participants often had the shortest journeys to gather water of the 3 sites, and most schools were built within easy access to one. However, it also presented an additional layer of gender inequality across these communities, with the key decision-making regarding the construction and maintenance of these boreholes generally being done by men, despite women being those primarily responsible for the gathering and cleaning of water in the households. Like Ethiopia, Ugandan participants were more unified in singling their regional government as the body responsible for water provision in their villages, tapped water provision in their villages, I should say, but were significantly more vocal in their criticism. According to their reporting, water is a deeply politicized issue, whereby those running for office regularly make promises regarding water infrastructure investment, which ultimately go unfulfilled. As for the technology deployed into Uganda, you can see on the screen there the sort of initial drawings of the Uganda and indeed South Africa, the larger SODIS reactors, as they were called, which show each glass cylindrical pipe able to contain between 50 and 200 liters of water placed above above a mirrored metal surface to increase or enhance the SODIS effect, which can be combined with other mechanisms such as a bubbler, again, to increase its potential effectiveness. Here we see them in situ. And there, particularly on the image on the right there, you see it combined with a large rainwater tank, which can be used to feed water into the top of the reactor, keeping it full, and in combination, able to treat actually an enormous amount of water in one go. Highly effective, but as I'm sure will be obvious to anyone, much more expensive, with the large aluminium frame and the several large glass cylindrical tanks, all having to be installed in place. In contrast to the participant hopes for the jerrycan and bucket technology in Ethiopia and Malawi, participants in Uganda had different perceived benefits from the SODIS technology, as reported in the social spatial survey and shown in the previous table. Only about 10% of respondents in Uganda considered reduction in incidence of diarrhea as the principal benefit, and instead were more likely to list its simplicity and, once installed, cost effectiveness as being more relevant to them. This, as I said previously, is likely a result of the significantly higher rates of reported water treatment found in Uganda as compared to Malawi and Ethiopia, and the prevalence of boiling water, which is a comparatively expensive method, as a primary treatment method found there. It is also important to note that the SODIS reactors installed in Uganda were based in local institutions, primary schools, rather than distributed for private domestic use. As such, it has made sense to link them as part of a larger discussion of governance and infrastructure, rather than personal or family level water treatment and knowledge. Linking to discussions of oversight, agency, and power, Ugandan respondents employed in the participating schools commented on the internal water hierarchies in these institutions, with a named teacher supported by student water prefects, often taking charge of the operation of the SODIS reactor. Overall, participants were extremely positive about the reactors and their impact on community health. Both parents and school faculty were positive about the reduction of rates of diarrhea amongst children, and there was a fair understanding of the core principles about its operation. It was also noted by some that because of the institutional control over the reactor, it was less likely to be improperly used compared to children using SODIS at home, for example. The systems were also praised for their ease of use and general convenience, and for the savings made from no longer having to purchase firewood. However, based on the reporting, it does appear that for significant periods, the reactors, or more importantly, their associated water tanks, were dry and thus non-functional. Some schools appear to have dealt with this by having children manually filling the reactors, while others had not. As such, it appears that the reactor's use is highly seasonal. Other concerns were noted based on the maintenance of the reactors with certain technical issues, such as leaking pipes and taps being reported. Furthermore, questions regarding the reactor's longevity were raised, and it was not clear to participants how the reactor would be maintained beyond the scope of the WaterSPOUTT project. Similar to Malawi, the SODIS process is clearly now well understood, even amongst respondents who did not directly use it. Indeed, when asked about their knowledge base with regard to general water treatment, some parents went on to discuss the reactors specifically, with some mentioning that incorrect use of SODIS bottles as a potential hazard to health, with the reactor being praised as a way of mitigating concerns about the improper use of domestic bottles. And finally, as mentioned above, due to the location of the Ugandan SODIS reactors, there was also a discussion of investment in and the maintenance of infrastructure for schools. Maintaining water collection and, with the reactors now, purification, infrastructure at these institutions being considered a key facet in the proper operation of the school itself. It is therefore important to note that unlike the jerry can and bucket, which were always intended to be affordable for purchase at household level, the initial financial cost of installing a single reactor is considerable and would be well beyond one of the school's normal operating budget without external financial assistance. So, how does one balance the strengths and weaknesses of a project of this nature? As a general response to the project overall, Ethiopian users described the SODIS jerry can very positively. Respondents noted the less labor-intensive nature of the treatment process compared to the normal method of water treatment, which was boiling, and reported either a decrease in rates of diarrhea amongst children or no change. Similarly, in Malawi, participants were positive about SODIS buckets. Respondents, both users and health workers, were especially positive about the reported decrease in cases of diarrhea amongst children, and initial issues surrounding children and livestock damaging the buckets appear to have been resolved via community adaptation. The value of the shared dialogue workshop process is also apparent here, especially in Malawi, and improvements made to the technology's design prior to mass production due to community involvement were substantial. However, in both Ethiopia and Malawi, respondent criticism of the SODIS technologies centered around what they considered a flimsy construction, with reports of the plastic softening and darkening with prolonged use. It is likely that a bucket or jerry can would only be effective as a water treatment device for a limited period, perhaps between 1 to 3 years, and this would doubtless have a constricting impact on its viability. As noted above, Ugandan respondents were less likely to focus praise of the reactors on perceived health benefits, though these benefits were also noted, and rather on convenience and the cost effectiveness of the system for users, as far where chemical treatments were not required. Again, however, it should be noted that while operating costs were minimal, the initial installation cost is many hundreds of euros, well beyond what most target communities could afford. And there was additionally the problem that the reactors had at times run dry, and it is apparent that SODIS has only been operating seasonally across some of the participating sites. Clearly, some schools had adapted their standard policy of having pupils bring a can of water as part of their normal routine, and instead had their pupils fill up the reactor in the morning, but this adaptation was not universal, and did increase the risk of the reactor being damaged during this manual refilling process. When considered together, ultimately the concerns raised regarding the construction of all three of these technologies mean it seems unlikely that any community which participated in the research will switch en masse to SODIS purification permanently at this time. And most participants will likely either cease treating their water or return to boiling or chlorination as their primary means of treatment. Furthermore, and more significantly, while generally positively received, most respondents were clear that the ultimate solution to their water issues was not a novel application of SODIS technology, but was simply the installation of piped water at the village or home level provided by local government. In most broader questioning regarding the water lives of participants, this was almost always the final conclusion of participants across all three nations, that interventions like WaterSPOUTT were welcome and are all well and good, but they are not a long-term solution. Overall, the WaterSPOUTT project did succeed in achieving its objectives in reducing microbial contamination of water and consequent illness rates amongst user populations, especially amongst children. It is hard to say exactly due to some issues with measurements and reporting, but it is likely participant communities saw a decrease in instances of child diarrhea by around 30% while using SODIS. This is undoubtedly a very positive result, and the SODIS process has been conclusively shown to be effective in quantities of water well above the conventional wisdom of 1 to 2 liters mentioned earlier. However, it is also clearly the case that any hope of a wholesale rollout of one or more of these technologies across a larger region where the consumption of unsafe water is the norm is highly unlikely. And now the project is concluded, SODIS will probably once again fade into the memories of these participating communities. Hopefully, this research can form the foundation for future work which solves the limitations of the method, but whether SODIS will go on to replace chlorination and boiling as the default water treatment very much remains to be seen. Many thanks for listening, folks. I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on this topic. Appreciate it, guys.